which we'll talk about a little more later. And we'll say, okay, now I'm in the code view now. And as you've learned, there's a design view, which shows what it's going to look like on the page approximately. A split view, which actually shows what's on the page on the right and the code on the left. And just the code view, which is the one I use a lot. Alright, so now the first thing to notice is there's the design view is totally blank, but there's a bunch of code in there, which kind of looks peculiar. And we'll look at why that is as we go along. But the first thing I want to point out is the basic parts of an HTML page, and Dreamweaver has already created those. The first thing is a doc type, which you don't need to worry about for now, and it, among other things, it just tells the browser, gives the browser information about what kind of code you're writing, XHTML1 transitional. Then we have the HTML tag, HTML element, and this is the beginning of the HTML element. This is the beginning tag. And it actually has an ending tag at the very end, and everything in the page besides this doc type is nested inside that HTML tag. Here's the beginning, here's the end, and we'll talk about what these other parts of the tag in a minute. Alright, and then another basic part is the head element. Here's the beginning, here's the end. There's a meta tag that goes in the head, which Dreamweaver writes for you automatically. I'd encourage you just to leave it the way it is. Then there's another very important tag that Dreamweaver puts in automatically. Another element that Dreamweaver puts in automatically within the head element, and that is the title. And it's very important to title your page because it helps search engines. It helps when you shows at the top of your page, if you create bookmarks, etc. A lot of different things will use that title tag to give information to your page. So you can change it down in the actual code, or there's a little thing in Dreamweaver where you can change the title and say it's like Richard's page. And so notice in the title tag it changed it. Oh, it also took away all my indents, which is sad. Alright, so anyway, I'm kind of trying to show you how these are nested. The head is this first important part, and then the body is the second important part, and here's the beginning of the body element, and there's the end. You notice there's nothing in there, and that's why there shows nothing in the design view, because the body is the element in which all the stuff that's going to be displayed directly on the web shows up. So if I say blah in here, just write the words blah, and we look at the split view. We look at the design view, you see blah. For some reason it did not show up in the... Okay, there it is in the split view. Alright, so that's the basic parts of the HTML page. The doc type, the HTML tag, the head tag, the body tag, and this really important one inside. I keep calling them tags, I mean elements. So let's talk a little bit about these HTML elements. I have so much trouble remembering the name. And so as I explained before, each one of these elements has a beginning tag and an ending tag. And the ending tag starts with a slash. Now there's a few exceptions, one of those being this meta element. And whenever there's an element that doesn't have an ending tag, you have to put this little slash at the end of the beginning tag, which means that's the end of this element. And that's something new that was introduced with XHTML, so that it was clear about beginning and ending of an element. But most of them will have this beginning tag, this ending tag. Now another characteristic of these HTML elements, which is also something that developed with XHTML, it's a characteristic of XHTML as compared to traditional HTML, which we'll talk more about in just a minute. But this one important thing is that the tags have to be properly nested. So you have to have one tag, the tag has to be inside of another tag. So it has to be clear how the hierarchy works. So for example, if I put /title here. Well, it won't let me because, I mean, Dreamweaver doesn't want me to do that because it knows I'm screwing up. But if I put, so for example, see the head element starts here and the head element ends here. The title element starts here and begins here. It's not nested. Neither of them is nested completely within the other one. And that's like illegal. You'll get struck down by the gods of HTML if you do that. Well, the gods of HTML don't really care. The gods of XHTML, they care a lot. So that's another characteristic of these elements, is they have to be properly nested, and we definitely want to use proper XHTML as much as possible because it makes the page much more powerful in working with other programs. Now another thing about these elements is they often have something that's called an attribute, and here is an attribute with the meta tag. The attribute is called HTTP equiv. And it has, that's the name, HTTP equiv. It has a content type is the actual value. Same thing, content has a name, and it has this value, and the value is actually this whole thing, text HTML, and with the semicolon character set, and it has the values are inside these quote marks. And let me show you another example. Let's say we go to design, we make this, here's a very typical attribute, is let's make this a link. And so we go down here to link, and we say http mst.edu. Now let's look at the code. Blah suddenly has become an HTML element, and that element is the A element. So see, it begins with A, ends with /A. But now it has this attribute, which is href blah blah, and href is the name, and the value of href is the http mst.edu. So there's an example of an HTML element that has a attribute, and the attribute has a name, and it has a value, and the value is within quotation marks. All right. Now, a very special type of HTML tag is the division tags, and the division tags are just div. What I'm going to do is show you, I'm going to make an absolute positioning div, which we'll do more in the future, so in another tutorial. But just for now, I go to layout. Remember, by the way, I have this at classic view. If you're not seeing these things at the top, go to classic view right here. So I go to this little AP tag thing. It says draw AP, AP div, and then I make this div, and in it I can make it a certain color and stuff like that. I could put stuff in it. But now if I look at the code, it shows this div ID. Well, first of all, the element is div. Here's the beginning of the div, here's the ends of the div. Second of all, it has this attribute with the name ID, and then the ID is apdiv1, and then I put in these letters in between beginning and ending tags. But this apdiv1 ID refers to, what that's saying is there's a CSS ID, that's a cascading style sheet thing, and it's called apdiv1. So you have to look up in the style sheets, which we'll talk about more in a later tutorial, and it defines apdiv1 with all these different characteristics. And so that's a special kind of tag, as a div tag with attributes. All it does is just, it's like a placekeeper that tells you about like one part of the page, one section of the page, and it's really popular nowadays, and it's used a lot in more advanced kind of HTML and XHTML. All right, well, there's just a couple more things I wanted to let you know. First of all, about this basic HTML. I've been talking about XHTML and HTML. I just want to note that XHTML is just HTML with a little more strict, well, some sense a lot stricter standards, so it can work more readily with XML and other sort of applications and programs. And so it just means it's stricter. So you have to have things properly nested. Notice everything's in lowercase. One characteristic of XHTML is everything's in lowercase. All the code, anyway, is in lowercase for any of the elements and any of the attributes. And they have to be properly nested, as I mentioned. And the structure has to have all these characteristics. It has to have the head tag, has to have the HTML tag, etc. In the old days, you could get away without having certain things. All right, well, one last thing I want to mention is obviously HTML would require a lot more than just a 15-minute little lecture, and it would take you a really long time to learn all the things about HTML, especially if you're going to memorize all the different elements and all their attributes and all the names and values, etc. So I just want to give you a couple of resources. One is that Dreamweaver actually has its own resources. So what I can do is I can go up to Help and then say Reference, and lo and behold, actually we'll have these O'Reilly HTML references. So I can look up a tag like A, which we've looked at. It describes the entire tag, and then it shows examples of the tag and stuff like that. And you can even look at all these different attributes of that tag. The most common one being href, and then it'll talk about that and values, etc. So you can look up any tag and it'll show you all of its attributes and all its values. Now honestly, I don't usually use that, believe it or not, very much. I'm probably like almost everybody else. I Google. Now there's another thing though, before I mention the obvious Google thing, which is a really good site called W3 Schools, and I couldn't remember the name, but I have it there already because I've been looking stuff up. And W3 Schools is just a great site for learning all kinds of stuff associated with HTML and CSS and PHP and etc. It's almost always it's pretty much the most popular site, and as evidenced by the fact that if you Google anything about HTML and related issues, you're very likely to find one of the top references being the W3 Schools. So then, of course, the third thing, as I mentioned, you can use the references in Dreamweaver, you can use W3 Schools, but I would just advise probably using Google. Alright, well that's the basics of HTML, and so hopefully you got a framework to start with.